Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel event on thinking differently about autism. My name is Aidan Healy. I'm the CEO of an organization called Lexic, and I'm also the campaign director for Neurodiversity Celebration Week. It was actually this time 1 month ago. It was the day before the start of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, but I'm delighted to be working in partnership again with the founder of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, Sienna Castellan, who's really been the visionary, the curator behind this event, and also our panel host today. Firstly, let me just start with some housekeeping. We are live on Zoom webinar because we're configured as a webinar. That means we cannot see you, we cannot hear you, and neither can anyone else. So please do make yourselves comfortable. This is a 90-minute event and we will run straight through without any intervals. Please do share any nice comments, your story, where you're from in the chat. Some of our panelists will be reading the chat throughout the session. And we also have Georgie and Sarah from Team Lexic who will be engaging with the chat as well. I will also say the chat is moderated, so if you are unkind or disrespectful, you will be muted quite quickly. This event is being recorded, as are all 5 of our panels today, and we will send you a copy of the recordings afterwards in a follow-up email, and we'll also send you some links to our panelists' social media tags and websites if you want to follow them or if you want to get in touch with them. And I suppose, look, just very briefly to give you a bit of background on this event, and Sienna can say a little bit more. April is a month which kind of marks a number of key dates often in the autism community, which is Autism Week, Autism Day, and Autism Month. But I think the view of many members in the autistic community is that well-meaning intentions really don't translate into impact or results. And many of the messaging around traditional autism awareness campaigns actually can be quite alienating for autistic people. I'm obviously going to let our panelists speak as to why this is, but the purpose of this event is to get you to think differently, to help shift stereotypes or outdated views of autism, to amplify the strength and vibrance of autistic culture and voices, and I suppose hopefully leave you with some takeaways as how you can support much needed autism inclusion. So I'm delighted to kind of be an ally here today and to kind of help amplify this event with myself and with Lexic. In terms of our panel today, we have a really great mix, and I'd like to pass over to our panel host now, Sienna Castellan, who will introduce herself and who will also introduce the other members of the panelists. So Sienna, you're very welcome. It's great to see you again, and over to you.
Thank you to everyone who is joining us on what promises to be a captivating discussion. Unlike other similar events, you will be hearing from actually autistic individuals who will be sharing their stories, insights, and experiences. My name is Sienna Castellan. I am a 19-year-old neurodiversity advocate, author of the Spectrum Girls Survival Guide, How to Grow Up Awesome and Autistic, and the founder of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, a global initiative that aims to challenge misconceptions about neurological differences and bring about neurodiversity acceptance, equality, and inclusion in schools and the workplace. I decided to put this event together because almost everything you think you know about autism comes from non-autistic people. Thinking differently about autism will change this by putting autistic voices front and center. For the next hour and 15 minutes, we will discuss a range of fascinating topics, from increasing autism inclusion in the workplace, the benefits of self-employment, the impact of masking on our mental health, autism burnout, autism leadership, and much, much more. At the end of our discussion, we will open up to a 15-minute Q&A session. But first, I'd like to introduce you to our amazing panel. Today, you will hear from Claire. Claire is currently a Fort Fellow at University of North Carolina at the Chapel Hill Canfiger Business School, where she is pursuing her MBA full-time. She founded the Carolina Disability Alliance in Flagler. Charlie. Charlie is an HR analyst and neurodiversity champion. Ryan. Ryan is a civil servant and autistic advocate. Laura. Laura is a writer, keynote speaker, and radio presenter. Ella. Ella is self-employed online content creator and public speaker. And Carol. Carol is a leading corporate champion of change through live virtual training and conference presentations, #neurodiversity at work. She is also the host of Mind Your Autistic Brain talk show. And last but not least, Gemma. Gemma is a solutions assistant manager and law graduate. To ensure the panel is neurodivergent friendly, I will be asking each of the 7 panelists specific questions on topics that are especially meaningful to them. This will ensure that each speaker has an equal opportunity to speak. So let us begin. One of the stereotypes about autism is that we lack the social skills and emotional intelligence to succeed in leadership roles. As Elon Musk and Greta Thunberg have demonstrated, this is a misconception. Claire. People often assume autistic people can join the workforce, but aren't suited for leadership positions. Why do you believe that's a misconception?
Thank you, Sienna, for having me and all of us onto this panel. And I think that's a really fascinating place to start our conversation, right? Because even as we try and help people understand that there's absolutely a place for autistic adults in the workplace, a lot of folks can get on board with that, and then they can't get to the place where they understand that autistic people can be leaders. And so that's a misconception I like to push back against. And I think it exists in large part because, I see this even in the business school I'm in. Actually, I want to say that because I've seen a professor stand up and say that, autistic people can't read faces and wouldn't be good leaders. And so it's even taught sometimes. But I think that misconception comes from the idea that if you have a communication related disorder, you would be a failure of a leader because leadership involves communication. But that simply can't be true because leadership involves about 50 different independent skills, and communication is an important one, but there might be other skills that you're naturally good at where communication is one you have to work at. And I think every leader has got a combination of skills that they have more naturally than others. So the idea that an autistic person might not be capable of practicing the things that are harder and then having good instincts about what it means to do the right thing. And I think one example of a place that we're naturally often talented, not exclusively, but is just being really honest in our assessment of things. And I think about how many leaders have been brought down by a lack of honesty. So I would turn that around and say we do have some unique strengths that contribute to leadership. And the idea that autistic people aren't suited for leadership is just an outdated stereotype that we get to push back against by having autistic people in leadership roles sort of come out and say, no, that's me. And here's exactly how I'm succeeding.
Thank you. Although most companies have diversity and inclusion strategies, these tend to overlook neurodiversity. Charlie, why are you so passionate about autism inclusion in the workplace? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, Charlie, you're on mute at the moment.
Sorry, so desperate not to talk over anybody. I'm still on mute. Thanks, Sienna. I was diagnosed autistic later in life after struggling for decades and having no idea why. So in 2018, I took my eldest child, who was 14 at the time, to see a psychiatrist about his extreme anxiety attacks. She listened and observed and concluded that what he was describing was something more extreme, autistic meltdowns. Yes, anxiety was an issue, but the underlying cause of his anxiety was autism. I myself had a long history of anxiety attacks, and my brother's autistic. So I started to wonder, could I be autistic? I went to the doctor to request an autism diagnosis. And a few months later, I was diagnosed autistic at the ripe old age of 42. This was extremely validating for me. Finally, I felt vindicated. My life started to make so much more sense. Finally, there was a tangible reason why I was weird and different, why I struggled with things that my peers seemed to take in their stride, such as meeting new people, saying the right thing at the right time. So at work, I immediately declared autism as a disability. Yes, autism brings me distinct advantages in my role as HR analyst, but it also brings significant challenges and difficulties. I consider myself disabled in some ways, enabled in others. I'm undeniably privileged because I felt safe and secure to come out as autistic at work. I'd worked for this employer for a few years and I work in HR, so I know the policies and processes. I know my employment law, I know my employment rights. So it was a position of privilege. I already had reasonable adjustments in place for my anxiety disorder. So we updated these to autism and looked at my specific needs. So I started talking openly about autism at work, delivering presentations to anybody who would listen about neurodiversity inclusion in the workplace, because I wanted to be a role model to help neurodivergent colleagues feel safe to disclose without fear of discrimination, to be able to effectively advocate for their own individual needs so that they can thrive at work as their authentic selves, unmasked, and with the understanding and support that they need. Yes, neurological diversity is advantageous to employers, but it's also about doing the right things. I also hope to help some of the many, many undiagnosed autistic people in the workplace to identify their neurology, to access the understanding, support, adjustments and employment protection they need, like I have. I think there's a lot of us that autism is far more common than people realise, and it's far more common than the misleading statistics suggest. So greater inclusion for all neurotypes needs to happen across society for people of all ages and neurotypes. But I'm personally well positioned to talk about autism inclusion in the workplace, and especially to other people that work in HR. Thank you.
Thank you. Ryan, what are some barriers that you have faced in the workplace and what recommendations do you have to address this?
Well, firstly, thanks for inviting me on. I know I'm a bit of a last minute substitution in. Unfortunately, Pete couldn't make it today, but I was happy to step in. I work in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. So I work in the Department of Finance. So the civil service in, I would say, most countries tend to be certainly the largest public sector employer. It can be anyone from general office workers, post men and women, firefighters even, or technically civil servants. But so normally, from my experience, I found that the civil service can be very good, but because of the size of the organization, you can sometimes face barriers that are specific to that. So in my area, a lot of our work is very bureaucratic. There's a lot of paperwork and all involved. And it's a case of things, for example, things could be just dropped on us and we're almost just expected to actually know how to do it. Whereas if I've not been taught or if I've not been given an explanation as to what it is, I'll be stranded. So things like that. So for example, our management needs to give us written instructions of new processes that are going to continue or that are going to be introduced, so that I have basically a record to refer back to. So if I'm going through the task and then get a bit lost or a bit muddled, of a written record to refer back to. So that's one of the barriers I faced. Another one can be sometimes colleagues who are perhaps resistant to change or are a bit stuck in their ways, let's say, and it's a case of more the culture. So for example, I wear these headphones in work as well. And basically, if you want to get my attention, you can stand behind my computer screen, and if you wave at me, I will see you in my line of sight. What you do not do is come up and touch my shoulder, or indeed touch my headphones, because that makes me jump out of the chair. So things like that, it was explained very quickly to a lot of people that you don't do that. However, there was a few people would not listen and still thought it was appropriate to go over and touch me in the shoulder. And it was only after a few weeks of this happening, I went to my line manager and said, look, this needs to stop because this is making me deeply uncomfortable. It's unwanted physical contact, frankly, from someone who I've given no permission to have any physical contact with me. And as I live and work in the UK, I'm protected by the Disability Discrimination Act, and I'm entitled to a working environment that is safe and that is supportive. And that is one thing, is that as well, the onus is never on you. The onus is on the employer to put it into place. It's not your job to justify why you need an adjustment. It's your right to have it, and you don't have to explain why you need it. If they try and deny it, it is their responsibility to explain why they won't put it in place. And I think a lot of people should know that. A lot of people sometimes seem to feel it's on them to sort out their own adjustments. And I think that needs to be addressed.
One of the major challenges autistic children have is access to their education. The education system is not designed to support us, and in many ways is rigged against us. Like many autistic students, I was forced to be home educated for a while because my school failed to make the most basic reasonable adjustments, and as a consequence, it was an intolerable environment for me. Laura, can you explain what the difference is between making a school accessible and making it inclusive? How are these two concepts different?
Hi everybody, and first of all, thank you Sienna for inviting me to speak today, in Lexic for putting on this wonderful event with all of these wonderful panellists. I'm very honoured to be here. I have been a teacher for 16 years. I have worked initially in what we call primary school, which would maybe be elementary school to our viewers in the US, and I now work in a secondary school. I've been a class teacher. I've been in what we call here support for learning, which is a SENCO in England, a role that is supporting pupils who have additional needs, who are neurodivergent, who have disabilities. And I've also been a school leader, been a principal teacher here in a Scottish primary school. And I'm really tired of the concept of inclusion, because inclusion to me is actually more like outclusion. In our education system, which kind of will be familiar to some people, we have what we call mainstream education, and then you have special education. And mainstream education in Scotland, and indeed in other parts of the UK, you have what's called a presumption of inclusion. Children should be included in their local school where possible, unless their needs can't be met there, and then they go into a special education school. And unfortunately, what that looks like is we have mainstream, and this is how we do it. This is what we do, and we are going to invite you, the neurodivergent, into our world, and we might put in some reasonable adjustments for you. We might give you a movement break. We might give you a wobble cushion, and we might give you a visual timetable, because that's the only three things that anyone ever talks about, of course, or fidget, sorry. That's the other thing. And then when those things don't work for you, and when we've been on the course telling us how to use those things, then it can't be our fault that you're still not doing well in school. It can't be our fault that you're still dysregulated, because we've included you, we've done our part. And therefore, inclusion is always the mainstream inviting us in from the outside. We don't belong. I want to belong in school. I want our children to belong in school. I don't want them to feel included. I want them to feel like they are part of the school. And that's what accessible education does, or the theory of accessible education. Accessibility means that classrooms would already be set up looking at the environment and the sensory environment and how that can fit a variety of needs. That will mean that text and lessons are delivered in a way that we know benefits all. It means that the way that teachers speak to pupils, the way that they interact with pupils, is done in mind for a variety of different needs. And yes, there will still be some pupils who need reasonable adjustments above that, But if we consider how to make the environment and the learning and teaching suitable for all, then we're not just including people, we are making it accessible, and there is a big difference in those concepts.
According to some studies, approximately 40% of neurodivergent individuals are self-employed. It is well known that about 30% of entrepreneurs are dyslexic, but you rarely hear about self-employed autistic people. Ella, as someone who is self-employed, what are some barriers you faced?
Hi, thanks, Sienna. Yeah, I've been self-employed since early adulthood, when I was fired from my very first job for answering honestly if they asked if I was bored. And I said yes, and was instantly fired, and realized at that point that I probably wasn't going to work for other people. I started out as a self-employed circus artist, and the biggest barrier at that point was the fact that obtaining jobs was a little bit of a popularity contest. So we would be hired each job at a time, so you're constantly looking for work, and every time the people that were hiring would hire the people that they'd most like to spend the weekend with on the job, on the performance job, and I was never that person. And it felt really frustrating that I wasn't being considered based on my skill set, but on my communication skills, which was really frustrating. And I find that even now, working as an autism advocate and speaker, it can still feel like the work goes to the people who manage to do the networking most skillfully. And I find networking, even in the autism community, really quite challenging, because I was diagnosed late, I carry a lot of trauma around dealing with other people, and I carry a lot of rejection sensitivity. And so I find that aspect really tricky. And so because I'm kind of off in my own world doing my own thing, I'm not networking, and that means that I often don't get considered. Another barrier that I found is the kind of imposter syndrome that I feel. I think because I was, again, diagnosed late, and because of the trauma that I carry, I often feel like maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I don't have the skill set that I need. And also because a lot of the skills that I and many other autistic people develop are kind of self-taught. We get really, really into something and we learn a lot about it. That means that I don't necessarily feel like, oh, I've gone and got this official certificate or qualification to say that I'm capable of doing this thing that you're looking to employ me for. And so rather than, you know, blowing my own trumpet and promoting myself, I'm much more likely to be like, oh yeah, well, I might be able to do it, you know, just about okay, but there might be someone who's better. And that's really not how you sell yourself for work. And I find that really challenging too. And then finally, the last thing that I find really difficult about being self-employed is because you're working one job at a time. Every job comes with a new set of information, timings, people you're working with, things that need to be delivered. You're not able to learn what the routine is and learn what is needed from you, and then just know that every time a new job comes in, you have to rely on the people that you're working for, communicating what's happening and the details around that efficiently and in a timely manner, which very, very rarely happens, even if you're working for an organization that say are about autism, which I often am. You're still kind of waiting for all those details last minute, and that can be really stressful because you're feeling anxious and you don't know what's expected or what the timescales will be. So I feel like that kind of like knowing what job you're doing next, knowing that there's going to be work that's going to keep you going when you're working job by job, can be really anxiety provoking and a little bit of a barrier in that area.
Due to the demands of masking and living in a world that isn't designed for us, many autistic people eventually burn out. Carol, what are a few of the top signposts autistics experience during autistic burnout?
Oh, this is such a good question, because that's one of the things that happens so often, especially in late identified life, is that we're exhausted, we're overwhelmed, and that's usually where we come to our identification late in life. And that is, everything just seems too much. It all of a sudden, everything is just more difficult. And one of the things that I talk about most often are the warning signs when we enter autistic burnout, or when we're entering autistic burnout. And I have a top 20 warning sign list if you guys would like to check that out. And I'm sure we'll pop that in the chat to get that link. But one of the top things that we feel are the overwhelming physical and mental exhaustion. Also, we can experience loss or decrease in skills and abilities that we once held. That's one of the things that is the biggest differentiator between a neuromajority burnout and an autistic burnout. And that is that our skills and abilities are directly impacted to where they can decrease or they can be lost for a period of time. That's a pretty big deal, especially for those of us who have worked for decades to hone and gather and accumulate those skills and abilities. Sensory sensitivities, they can increase where sound or light or any of our sensory items become escalated and everything is so big and feels very large. It can also do the opposite to where you feel everything is decreased. It's almost like you feel very numb. You can experience both of these as a warning sign that you are entering or are in autistic burnout. Emotions, these can increase where you become much more emotional. You feel all sorts of feelings, a lot of dysregulation in that. And it can also go in the opposite direction where they have decreased very noticeably, where you just sort of feel like you have no particular set of emotions. It's just sort of almost like you're in this fog or this sort of underwater floating without really feeling anything. And so many of these things, especially in my late identified life, 8 years ago at 39, I was identified as autistic and ADHD. And when that happens, it can be really scary when you don't recognize what's happening, but maybe it's the worst burnout you've ever had. For many of us, especially late identified adults, we go through what I call the chronic cycle burnout trap, where we enter a period of autistic burnout only to unplug, make a few changes in our lives. We start to feel better and recover. And then all of a sudden, we start to go back to life as normal. And then a few weeks or a few months later, we're right back in it. And we never fully restore, and we never get to a place of where our needs are getting met, to where we're thriving. And that's really what I love to focus on. It's one of the most important things that as autistics, we can really be cognizant and aware of and take intentional action on, because without energy, without our spoons, everything is much harder. Everything is much more difficult for us. And to have a supportive network to put those things in place and just start identifying them makes a huge difference in our lives.
Sadly, autistic people have a very low employment rate. Some statistics put it as low as 16%. Gemma, why do you think the percentage of autistic people in employment is so low? What is it that is missing from employers' diversity and inclusion?
Thank you, Sienna. In hiring practices, there are often required skills that aren't in the job description. There's an expectation that you be chatty, communicate verbally using tones, that the interviewer can relate to you, and that you make eye contact, etc. I've witnessed this throughout my life and in education too, when despite getting perfect grades, the focus at parents' evenings was that I didn't really speak, which was because I really just didn't know what to say or what I was meant to say. And focusing on these socially desired traits and not on our actual skills is not good for us, but also not helpful for organisations, as you'll miss out on what we have to offer by focusing on something that's only subjectively important. I've been rejected from jobs and given feedback that it was due to not seeming interested and not chatting enough, which are all part of me being autistic and presenting myself and communicating differently, and they knew I was autistic. I was offered extra time in an assessment as an adjustment, but not acceptance of my differences, which is what I actually needed. Another reason for such high autistic unemployment is the myth that autistic people are only good at low-level tech roles. Without going into a nature-nurture debate, undoubtedly all of our environments, upbringing, and different experiences shape us. This is why we aren't all the same. We have different interests, talents, skills. The spectrum of commonalities that we often share do not determine that we're only good at coding and maths. We need to be employed into all roles. I have a law degree, but I found that getting a job in a more technical role was easier for me to get. And whilst I do really enjoy it, I know I could have been a good lawyer too. I might just have done it differently to the current norm. It's a myth that autistic people can only work in rules-based roles. Autistic people can be incredibly creative too. So inclusion should not be limited only to specific roles. The bias towards neurotypical people and the misunderstanding and fear of anyone who's different means that D&I initiatives are often lacking the willingness to hire and retain people who are actually different. Instead, they often hire autistic people, hoping and expecting them to appear and act as neurotypicals. But being autistic and how we operate isn't bad or wrong, it's just different. And a final point on superpowers. We do have great skills we can bring, but also all humans deserve basic human respect and acceptance, even if we are average autistic people, just as very average neurotypical people receive. Autistic people shouldn't only be valuable if they're geniuses. That's not acceptance, that's exploitation. You don't only hire neurotypical people if they have superpowers. They can be good at what they do, but not extraordinary, and that's enough.
Service dogs can be enormously beneficial to autistic people, including helping to facilitate interaction with the world around them. Claire, you are a service animal handler. Can you explain what tasks a service dog might perform for a neurodivergent person?
Certainly. And I like to clarify too what that term means, because I know that in different countries, different language is used around service animals. And in the United States, it could refer to a dog or a miniature horse, although I've never seen that used personally in the US. And generally, the user of the service animal is also the handler. So just the idea that whether they were trained through an organization or self-trained, that you work with that dog on a daily basis as the person who also benefits from it. So while working at a disability research center at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, I realized that there were people on the spectrum using service animals, and it hadn't occurred to me before that was an accommodation that could be implemented. But as I read into the law, I realized it absolutely could be. And as I read into people's experiences, I realized that there were lots of folks who use service animals for things related to neurodiversity, particularly autism, sometimes ADHD. And some of those tasks that frequently came up were things like for children, anchoring so that they didn't run away. And that's often young children who might put themselves in danger by running away. Also medication reminders, interruption of panic or anxiety attacks. Some bigger dogs have even been trained to do like deep pressure therapy, and the handler will lay down and they'll be able to like almost lie down in the right place and give them a hug. And it ends up being really calming for that person. And you talk about social inclusion. And I think an important distinction in the US is that even if the dog provides an enormous transformation in your feeling of confidence interacting with others, our law doesn't consider it a service animal. It has to be trained to do an active task. So while it's been an enormous benefit for me to have something that starts conversations with everyone, and to feel like that's a reason I'm accepted, like people aren't sure what to make of Claire, but they know exactly what to make of Maeve, my service dog, because she's really cute. Her task technically is providing medication reminders, which is also tremendously helpful as someone with a really, really poor sense of time and working memory. But I've always encouraged people on the spectrum to consider a service animal, because it is absolutely your right in the US to use one to mitigate some of the negative symptoms of autism, but also to understand that as somebody with an invisible disability, people are going to ask you a lot of questions.
There are probably lots of people in our audience who would like to help to create a more inclusive work environment for autistic individuals, but who may be worried about getting it wrong or be unsure as to how to go about it. Charlie, what could managers and colleagues do to be more inclusive or better allies to autistic co-workers?
Thanks, Sienna. Inclusion is about getting to know individuals and understanding that everybody has a unique set of skills, challenges, needs and preferences. So please step away from that cookie cutter. Get to know your colleagues and candidates as individuals. Remember that many neurological differences go undiagnosed. That doesn't mean that the support needs don't exist. Ask your team member or your teammate about their preferred ways of working, rather than making sweeping assumptions based on stereotypes. The workplace can be an overwhelming social and sensory minefield for neurodivergent people. So we need compassion and understanding. We need our needs and preferences to be heard and not dismissed. And please don't judge us by neurotypical communication standards. For example, please don't think we're rude or unapproachable just because we're wearing headphones. They might be a coping strategy. Please don't assume we don't care about you just because we don't make the standard small talk about your weekend or your holiday. And we can be passionate about our topics of interest. So if we get carried away and dominate a meeting, please be direct rather than dropping subtle hints. I'd rather you just say, Charlie, we've had a lot of input from you. Let's give somebody else a chance to speak, rather than nudging me and catching my eye. On the other hand, when facilitating a meeting, please ensure that quieter, less verbally confident introverts can contribute as well, possibly in the chat panel, possibly by email. Please accept us as our authentic selves. Help us to feel safe to communicate our challenges and needs. This can give us the best chance to thrive unmasked in the workplace. Neurological diversity is an advantage, so it is a good idea to remove barriers to inclusion that treat everybody alike. But frankly, it's just the right thing to do.
Ryan, what are some strengths and attributes that autistic people can bring to the workplace?
I think, obviously, like every other person on the planet, we all have our different strengths and weaknesses. I think part of the problem with the employment is that we are stereotyped that we will only have certain strengths, or we all have the same weaknesses. And it's a case of then certain people will say, oh, you're autistic, you have to go into computer coding, for example, or you have to go into something to do with computers. And you're immediately then you're putting barriers in front of people who want to go into the more creative areas, or indeed who just don't have any interest in computers. I know many autistic people, who, including myself, some days doesn't even want to look at a computer. But things like that, and then the deficit-driven model. For example, I would sometimes in work I'd have been considered quite pedantic, or sort of maybe quite nitpicky, but ironically a lot of my work is actually quality control, so being pedantic or nitpicky is actually quite valuable skills to have. So it's a case of looking and instead of trying to crowbar someone in the job they're not suitable for, instead of going, right, let's see how we can make them just about cope in this job, it's a case of flipping it around and looking and saying, okay, what is that person good at? Where will they thrive? What is the environment that they feel is the best for them? And let's see which areas out there provide that already, rather than trying to turn an unsuitable environment into something that's just about passes for something they can just about survive in. Why not look instead of just basically it's a case of instead of looking what can we not do and go, okay, what are you good at, rather than, because you don't do that with any other walk of life. You don't pick things based upon what you're least worst at. You look at what you're best at and go from there. And it's things like, for example, qualifications. I went to university, but I didn't finish my degree because I was doing a law degree and it didn't fit with my chosen field. I was in the area of doing work placements and all, and just every day the message I was telling myself was, I do not want to do this as a career. And there was certainly significant pressure on me not to leave, because most lawyers, obviously it can be a financially lucrative job, and it's seen as very prestigious, but it was just fundamentally not something. It was something I did not want to do. So it's things like that. I think it's important to learn what it is you want to do, what it is you're good at, and also don't be afraid to assert your rights and say, no, I know. For example, a lot of things obviously with pandemic sort of starting to come towards the end. Obviously a lot of people who've been working from home are very concerned about they may be forced back into an office where they do not want to be. And in the UK especially, you have a right to remain working remotely. If your employer cannot explain why you absolutely cannot do your job from home.
Teachers hold a lot of power. They have the ability to build you up or tear you down. As a neurodivergent student, most of my teachers misunderstood me and often lowered their expectations or dismissed me. My favorite teachers and the ones I learned the most from were neurodivergent. On the rare occasion I was taught by a neurodivergent teacher, I felt they got me and that they were on my side. Laura, what are the benefits of having autistic and neurodivergent teachers in the classroom and the education sector more generally?
Well, first of all, the education sector should represent the pupils that it serves, and it should represent the student body. Now, in the UK, we say roughly 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent, 1 in 10 are autistic, we estimate. But the only figure that we've ever had trying to measure that within the workforce was that the Department for Education, which is England only, did a study of how many disabled teachers there were in the workforce, and only 4%, not even 5%, 4% of the education workforce in England identify as disabled. And within that will be the autistic and neurodivergent figure. Now, obviously, some neurodivergent people may not identify as disabled, but there's been no attempt to try and find out whether or not how many there are in the workforce. Now, we do know that there are barriers to disclosure, obviously, but just taking that figure of disability, 18% of the workforce in the UK is estimated to be disabled, but only 4% in the education workforce. How are we representing our students? Where I'm from in Scotland, there are 278,000 pupils that we know of in our schools. That's in a population of 5 million people. We're quite small, who are identified as having additional needs and disabilities. That's the size of the city of Aberdeen. And yet I run a group for autistic teachers, and when we first started, we got about 100 members very quickly, and only 5 of us felt safe enough to disclose our autism at work. So we need to represent our pupils. I, as an autistic teacher, and I'm very open, I'm very out about being autistic. I've got ADHD, I'm dyslexic, and all of the other things that go along. I'm also hard of hearing, I have 2 hearing aids. Pupils come and talk to me all of the time. I run a neurodiversity group inspired by Sienna, really, in school, but at other times pupils will come and talk to me and say just things like, "Miss, did you ever," and then they'll tell me something that they think is really odd and strange about themselves that they've never been able to disclose to anyone else. And I'll say, "Oh yeah, I do that all of the time." And then all of a sudden they don't feel so alone. I'm able to build capacity with other staff in the school by helping them to support those students and those pupils, by helping them to understand maybe how their pupil is thinking and how maybe they can support them better. There are a variety of really good things that neurodivergent and autistic teachers can do, from being the person, like you said, Sienna, the teachers who worked with you and you felt safe with and you felt that you were able to get on with in class, to being able to support other members of staff, but also really just to show both pupils and parents that are sitting in the school, I can be a teacher one day. My child could be a teacher one day. They can be anything one day. And I've had parents break down in tears before because they found out that their child's teacher was autistic, and all of a sudden they realised that their child had a future and their child could get a job and their child could get a mortgage and have children and have a really boring, mundane life like me. And essentially that's what everybody, I think, hopes for their child. So we do need more representation. We need the people in our schools representing the pupils that are within them.
Ella, what advice would you give to an autistic person who is thinking about starting their own business?
I would say my first piece of advice, which was a challenge that I had, was finding an organisation system and routines in my day that help me to feel like there is some sameness in my day, because being self-employed often means that every day looks very different, and definitely means staying on top of task management. So and a lot of the organisation systems which are touted as being really effective just didn't really work for my mind. So I spent a really long time developing a system that work for me. And I use techniques like the Pomodoro technique, which is a technique where you set a timer and you only focus on work until the timer's done and then you get a break. I use systems like that to help me stay on task. I would also say it's really useful if you can possibly get support to delegate aspects of the work that might be more challenging for you. So in my role, doing what I do, I'm really happy and comfortable making the content and doing the scripting and doing the editing and the more creative side, but dealing with emails and organization and phone calls is trickier for me. So as soon as I was able, I employed someone who could help me with those tasks, which takes me on to my next point, really, which is to kind of look at what your strengths are, kind of using a strengths-based approach, which is looking at what your strengths are and using the strengths that you've identified to figure out what accommodations or adjustments you might need to make for yourself in order to lean into those strengths. So for me, for example, one of my challenges is demand avoidance. I have a significant amount of demand avoidance. So as soon as I've said yes to a job, I'm instantly panicking and wishing that I hadn't said yes to the job and trying to figure out how to get out of the job. So in order to accommodate that, I am still telling myself that I have a paid hobby rather than actually admitting that I have a job, because for some reason that makes it possible for me to do what I do. Whereas if I actually thought of my business as an actual business, I'd probably get scared and run away. So identifying those accommodations that help your strengths to come to the front was a really important part for me to be able to do the best work that I can. So to sum that up, rhythms, systems that work for your brain, identifying your strengths and therefore what accommodations you'll need to make that possible, and getting support with the tasks that you find more difficult.
For those in our audience who may have additional neurological differences, it may sometimes be difficult to identify autism burnout from one caused by another neurotype. Carol, what are the biggest differences between burnout and neurotypes?
Well, one of the biggest differences, because in work, you hear about burnout all the time. You hear it discussed across the board, regardless of your neurotype. It seems to be that work induces more burnout than anything else. For us as autistics, burnout happens in all aspects, and because needs are going consistently unmet. The biggest difference between a neuromajority burnout, which the similarities are overlapping in that there's physical and mental exhaustion, feeling of cynicism, anger, irritability, emptiness, hopelessness. Those seem to be a little bit more prevalent in sort of a neuromajority burnout, and the recovery can take a little bit. For us, it's very different. It impacts our skills and abilities, our executive functioning, how we are able to operate. And that is one of the biggest differences that we face, one of the biggest challenges, because when we are in autistic burnout, quite often we don't recognize, because it's sort of this slow progression that happens over time. And it slowly builds up. And I describe it as sort of like a lasagna. You've got all of these layers that start to add up one to another, and then you're compounding them. And all of a sudden, one day, you're just like, I can't get out of bed today. Getting dressed is just more than I can absolutely do. Brain fog gets so intense, and it's very difficult to focus. If you are thinking about burnout like this, for most people, we try and push through it because we're like, okay, I've got so much to do. I have to do these things. And for autistics, we have this great sense of responsibility, of not letting anyone down, this sense of getting things done. If we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it, regardless of if it's going to kill us or not. We're going to keep pushing and pushing. And a lot of times that is one of the biggest things that keeps leading to that chronic cycle burnout trap, is that we continue to push and push without putting the things in place. And so the biggest difference there is how our skills and abilities are impacted. However, those skills and abilities that we temporarily lose in a burnout, some research was showing that those skills and abilities can be permanently lost, especially if you're in that chronic cycle burnout loop and you're consistently going back into it and not hitting periods of restoration. That the more you do that, the more decreased some of your skills and abilities can become, which is terrifying, right, guys? What I have learned and what has been really phenomenal is I'm entering year 3 of thriving, of not being in burnout. For the first time in my life, I am almost 48 in May, since I was age 6 at my first burnout. And it has been due to restoration, learning how to identify what my needs are. And in that, what I've learned and what I found is that those things I thought I had permanently lost, like creative writing, have started to come back. So there's hope. There is a possibility for these things to come back when restoration is in place. So do not give up. Do not feel that this is hopeless.
You and I are lucky in that we got diagnosed with being autistic relatively early. I was diagnosed at the age of 12 in a very convoluted way, after years of relentless bullying and being misunderstood. In my case, my anxiety skyrocketed, which caused my sensory processing disorder to become intolerable. It was a pain management expert who suggested I could be autistic and who recommended I be assessed. Gemma, you were diagnosed as autistic when you were 16. What impact did masking in your younger years have on your mental health?
So before being diagnosed, if I did anything unusual or that was different to my peers, it was deemed as wrong. I thought I was failing because I didn't understand how to interact with other people or how to make friends, and I was forced to conform to the right way of doing things. I tried my best to do what I was told was the right thing and started copying people, practicing phrases and facial expressions in the mirror before school. And I just wanted to get it right, and I couldn't understand how I was seen as misbehaving if I was having a meltdown due to sensory overload. And this eventually led to me being diagnosed with depression when the sort of social politics of teenagers really came into play and masking became much more complex and was draining me, and I couldn't keep up with pretending to fit in. And then over a year later, after having been referred to multiple different doctors, psychiatrists, and ending up in hospital when a depressive episode almost went too far, a psychologist finally worked out that I was autistic, and I was suffering from extended masking and not understanding why I felt like I still didn't fit in or belong. And in the diagnosis process, it listed autistic people's deficits, not differences or strengths. I was viewed as bad at XYZ, and it's something you don't see in other areas. Like, you wouldn't define something like a dolphin by saying it's bad at walking on land. It just doesn't do that. But that's often how it's wrongly determined that people are autistic. And once I was diagnosed, I was told by multiple people to say that I have mild Asperger's because appearing more normal was better. And being told that your identity as an autistic person is wrong and less professional is very damaging when that's just who you are. Autism is normal to me, and I like who I am. Masking isn't just something that I did before I knew I was different and then stopped doing once diagnosed. It's hard to remove a mask and a way of being that you've created over many years of trying to behave right. Even if there's so much pain that masking is causing you, you end up forgetting who you really are without the mask and what it feels like to be natural and comfortable. So I unintentionally end up masking a lot in social interactions still, as I know that even if this is uncomfortable to me, I'll get through conversations and interactions with much less judgment and be more successful than if I was just myself. And this really has to change, which is why acceptance of autism is needed. People need to learn to notice and understand autistic behaviour, just as we try to learn and understand theirs. I recently received a trauma diagnosis from being forced to mask when I was younger, which is sadly all too common amongst autistic people. And the lessons that these effects of masking have taught me are that being verbal, small talking, staring at eyeballs, sitting in a chair shape are not the right or only way of doing things. And social norms being forced upon us and being in the wrong environment is what disables us, rather than us being innately disabled by autism. And by forcing autistic people to change, you might not see, feel, or understand what that is doing to them. But when you listen to autistic people's experiences with mental health, this does show the negative impact. So it's not better to be more neurotypical. Being different is good. It just needs to be understood.
One of the challenges of being autistic is that it is an invisible disability. As such, people can sometimes be less understanding and willing to make accommodations. Claire, have you ever experienced difficulty trying to access spaces with a service dog as somebody whose disabilities are invisible?
Yeah, it's sort of what people are talking about, this imposter syndrome. It really hits you when you're standing there with your, accommodative device, technically by US law, and someone's like, you don't need that. And so there have absolutely been multiple places here where a restaurant says, like, they don't care if it's a service dog, you're not coming in. Or I was trying to go to a friend's birthday party at an event center in Indianapolis, Indiana, and like stood outside in the cold in December for like an hour waiting on the police to show up, and just like let the owner of the business know that actually they were violating the law. Like they couldn't trust me to pull it up on my own. So that's something with a service animal in particular I've encountered. And I think it's a somewhat extreme case because it's really unexpected if they can't tell what your disability is to see you walk up with a service animal and say, yes, it is a task trained animal. But that said, I think it happens with a lot of other accommodations too. If the person giving it can't figure out why you need it, they don't feel obligated to give it to you. And it's part of the discussion happening in the Q&A about like, how do you explain what accommodation you need? When is an employer obligated to provide it, even if they don't get what it's for, even if it's hard for them? And I having continued to encourage people to know your rights in the place that you live, but ideally not to start there, right? Like, because you do come off as really combative, and you may have a right to be combative, but it doesn't help you get to a place where people actually understand you better. So it does sort of suck to always be trying to figure out how to make other people feel good about doing what they're supposed to do. But that's the place I always begin from, because otherwise I'm not getting anywhere. Sometimes literally, if I'm not going to be allowed through a door or into a place. So I've encouraged people to know their rights, but to try and start from a place of, you may not know this, but let me tell you like what having this accommodation means to me. And there are different rules around the world about how much you have to disclose about your own needs or diagnosis in order to request an accommodation. But if you can, try to establish the common ground with the person that like they want to help you too, right? And usually I found that people want to think of themselves as good people. So if you start with that assumption, then they're hesitant to push back. I will also say I have been in a scenario before at a US ski resort where I was like, I can't go out for a full day of skiing like I've done all my life up to having a service animal. If now my animal can't come with me. And they really struggled with the idea that I didn't need an accommodation before and then did. And I said, well, I found something that worked for me better than anything else ever had before. And I'm not going to disrupt the use of that accommodation for the week that I'm here with my family. And so I've had to pull out the law before and meet with the director of this and that and the other in order to be heard, but that's not where I like to start. And I think it's more effective if we can find a way to more say, like, I know you want me to be able to access this space. So what do we need to do for you to understand the value of this accommodation?
There is still so much to be done in terms of bringing about autism acceptance and inclusion. However, events like this are very empowering because they allow us to showcase the breadth and diversity of the autistic community. The speakers that have been part of thinking differently about autism are a microcosm of our community. There are thousands of us out there trying to carve a better life for ourselves and future generations. Charlie, what are your hopes and dreams for the future?
My dream is for everybody to understand how and why we should all celebrate and respect all the natural variations in the human condition, freeing everybody to be their authentic selves, enabling individuals to identify and communicate their needs with no need to mask or to look for a way out. I never want to hear anybody be told that they should act more normal or try to fit in or keep quiet about some aspect of their identity. My own son did not survive being an autistic teenager in a neurotypical world. He tragically left it behind, aged just 15. I'm hopeful that together we can promote understanding and acceptance of autism and other neurological differences. And together we can make the world a more hospitable place for my daughters and others. I want to spread the message that different is okay, to educate others about how common and okay it is to be neurodivergent or LGBT or any other human difference. Most of us don't strive for normality. It's not some gold standard for the human condition. We long to be appreciated and loved for exactly who we really are. As my youngest daughter once said, normal is just a mode on Minecraft, and it's not even the best mode. Thank you.
Most autistic people take comfort in the certainty of routines. Big changes can be especially stressful for us. Ryan, as someone who has recently moved house, what advice would you give to those who are worried about future changes in their living arrangements, including how to manage the stress of moving home?
The first thing I will say is that regardless of what you do, it will be stressful. The fact that you're packing up your life and moving it to somewhere else, it will be stressful, but there are things you can do. What I would say is do not do what I did and leave it all to the last minute. That was a very silly thing to do, and I didn't realize how much junk I owned, frankly. But it's a case of if you have everything organized by room. So, for example, if you pack up all the stuff that is to go into the kitchen, keep that packed separately to stuff that's going to go into the living room. So, for example, the day we moved in, obviously the things you need to unpacked immediately was, some change of clothes and things to cook dinner with. Although admittedly, I did just order a takeaway. But it's a thing basically. So as you're unpacking, the first things that are lifted out, obviously, you can do without the pictures on the wall, but things like, for example, clothing, certain essential furniture, and sort of cleaning products, things like that. And it's just a case of them be organized and work out what date you're going to be moving at, and also make sure there's no need to move it all in one go. For example, I've my car's not the biggest, so it took 2 or 3 sort of return trips. I was maybe lucky enough, it's only a 40-minute drive from my old house to my new one. And as well, it's a case of just do it at your speed. For example, I moved house in February, but I'm still not completely done. I'm actually currently staring at a TV that does need to be mounted on the wall. And I've been putting that off for a while. But it's the thing is, it will be stressful. But if you even just sit down and write a checklist and basically go through, and if everything's packed up, certain things will be stressful. But I understand as well, it's a case of sometimes you might have deadlines to meet. The most important thing is always make sure you have a change of clothes and just general cleaning products and something to eat and something to drink. They're the main things. All the other stuff you can do without for a day or two. As well, things will, as neatly as you do it, things will go missing. I have a signed copy of Neurotribes by Steve Silberman that went missing during my move, and a few of you may have seen my major panic attack on Twitter about it. I eventually found it. Thankfully, it turns out my girlfriend had left it and packed it for safekeeping, but she had moved it from the location I'd put it in for safekeeping, so it sort of threw everything about. But it is a thing. Obviously, I think most of us will go through at some stage, and maybe some of us have went through. It will be stressful. There's no two ways around that. But I think knowing it's going to be stressful is almost half the battle. Everyone I always talk to says it's going to be stressful, but there's certain things that you are in control of. If you're in control of them, you can do something about it. If you're not, there's no point in stressing about it because it's not going to change anything. My current predicament is that we'll have a garage, which I didn't have before, and I really don't know what to do with it. I'm thinking some sort of sensory thing, but some comedians have suggested put a car in it, but I don't know anyone who actually uses their garage for cars. Also, just to clarify, I think I got cut off a bit when I was talking about the moving from working from home to the office. Basically, in the UK at least, unless it is your employer's responsibility to justify why you have to go back, it is not your responsibility to justify why you don't. They basically have to make the case that you cannot do your job from home. If you've been able to do your job from home the last 2 years, my thing is the case has already been decided in your favor, and you've proven it works. They cannot force you back just because it's easier for them. The reasonable adjustments aren't to make things easier for them, it's to make things better for you. You have your rights, and if working from home is the best option for you, you absolutely have the right to continue that, regardless of what your manager says. They can ask you if you want to come back to the office. They cannot force you.
There are very few openly autistic teachers in the education sector. Laura, what are some of the barriers faced by autistic and neurodivergent educators?
So I actually just put a link in the chat. I've written a chapter about this recently for a book. It's called Diverse Educators, the Manifesto, and the link's in the chat. And it's basically about the barriers faced by autistic teachers. And actually a lot of the things that we've heard from Ryan, from Claire, particularly when she was talking about leadership earlier, things that Charlie and Ella have said, and even actually when Gemma was talking about the type of careers that people think that you're suitable for, are all barriers that autistic teachers will face. Something that's maybe slightly more particular to the teaching profession is that your colleagues think of you as the pupils, the autistic pupils in school, and unfortunately, teachers don't always have a particularly high opinion of their autistic pupils or their neurodivergent pupils. In fact, we are chronically underestimated unless we fit into that genius narrative box, unless we are the white boy generally who is good at maths and science and engineering, and they think that, and they don't actually have to give us a lot of input. Then apart from fitting that particular role, our teachers often think of us and speak of us in terms of behaviour, and by behaviour they mean undesirable behaviour, and by undesirable behaviour we are almost labelled by diagnosis as being a problem before we get into the class, and unfortunately that's often how they view autistic educators. I've not had good experiences, and I can't sugarcoat that in any particular way. I've not had good experiences because people know that I am autistic, but at the same time, because people know that I am autistic and because my employer does, and because I have rights, and you know, we've heard Ryan in particular talking a lot about the law, and we've heard Claire talking a lot about the law in the US. You need to know your rights, and Charlie as well, she talked about that in the HR sector. You need to know that it is your employer's right to have, it is your employer's obligation to create a safe workspace for you. Now, some of the things I have experienced are everything from someone who spoke to me like a normal person before, then infantilizing me, and I'm not exaggerating to say that they used a baby voice while speaking to me in a meeting, and I was so taken aback by it, I turned around in front of everyone and said, "Are you okay?" I actually thought that they'd had a stroke because of the voice that they were using with me. It was that particularly awful. I have had a head teacher stand outside of my classroom and listen in to things that I was teaching, and had my pupil support assistants report back on me, despite me having worked in that school for 6 years before they arrived and having been highly thought of. I have definitely not been considered for jobs because they think that, oh, autistic people, they can't cope with a lot of things. And I have had lots of assumptions made about my abilities, and it offends me because I'm very, very capable at my job. I'm very highly thought of in my job. And in the 16 years that I have been teaching, all pupils and all parents agree with that. It's my colleagues that tend to be the issue. So actually the biggest barrier to being a teacher and being autistic is probably those things that everyone else has spoken about getting into the profession in the first place, getting past the interview, thinking of yourself as someone who would be good at being a teacher. And then once you're there, having the confidence to disclose that, and knowing how to disclose it, who to disclose it to, how to ask for adjustments. And then I think lastly, the biggest barrier that you're going to have is your colleagues. And that's why a lot of the neurodiversity celebration week where I champion so much in my schools and in my local area, because if I can get them on board with being nice to the children, then maybe they'll be nicer to me.
Although many companies are starting to be more neurodivergent and inclusive, we still have a long way to go. One of the benefits of self-employment is that it puts you in the driving seat and that you are not at the mercy of your employer being receptive to accommodating your needs. Ella, as someone who is autistic, what are some of the benefits and advantages of starting your own business?
For me, starting my own business kind of felt like the only way that I could be employed, because I, as well as my neurodivergent conditions, I also have physical disabilities that mean that I have to carefully pace my energy, both from a kind of mental point of view and a physical point of view. And so I need the flexibility that being self-employed provides me with to be able to actually do anything. And prior to the job that I do now, I was actually unemployed for about 10 years. And during that time, although I was mothering my children, I kind of felt like I wasn't putting anything out into the world or doing anything, which made me feel really, really like there was no point in me, and it really didn't help my self-esteem. So being able to start my own business, which has given me the flexibility to work less hours and to work the hours that I find easiest to work. For example, I don't work very well after about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which might be why I'm now losing the ability to speak, because I become really tired. So I need to do all of my work in the morning. So the flexibility to arrange my day and my workload like that is a big advantage. Being able to lean into my strengths, I felt like around peg square, see, losing the ability to speak, I felt like I was trying to squash myself into a box when I was trying to work for other people, and like nothing I did was ever good enough or right or the same as everybody else. Whereas the job that I do now, because it's not a job I could apply for, it's a job that I've defined, there is no wrong way of doing it because the job is my job that I have defined. And then I think gosh, sorry, brain. I think really flexibility, being able to lean into your strengths, being able to set your own rhythms, and also like a level of pride that comes, I guess, of having created my own thing in the world that feels like something that wouldn't exist if I hadn't made it, makes me feel really proud of who I am. And anything that helps with your self-esteem when you are neurodivergent and you've had challenges with that has to be a good thing.
Although I've read a lot about autistic burnout, less has been written about how to help someone in burnout. Cal, what are some resources, what are some restoration tips and accommodation ideas to help someone in burnout who is also working?
Oh man, this was such a big one for me and for so many of my coaching clients. This is something that is a really big part, is when you are, I know I'm a mom to 2 teenage boys who are, one is autistic and one is ADHD. You know, hey, their mom is both. So we have all of these things in our very neurodiverse family. And that was when I was working full time and I was in burnout. And just looking back on that, because I didn't know at the time how I struggled and how that truly impacted not just my work life, but my home life, because I didn't have the energy or the wherewithal to live the life that I wanted. And it dramatically impacted the way I was also feeling and thinking about myself. You know, there was a lot of mom guilt. There was a lot of shame of not being able to perform at work the way I wanted to, or I knew that I could, because in that time of burnout, I just wasn't able. And so one of the best ways to restore from burnout, and it is possible to restore from burnout and to stay off that chronic cycle burnout trap, is to begin by identifying what I call your signposts. And signposts are the identifiers that you are moving into burnout territory and your needs are going unmet. We all have short periods of stress or in circumstances where our needs are going unmet, but where we get into trouble is when our needs are going consistently unmet over time. This results in signposts. So for example, a signpost is, for me, I make my bed every morning. That's part of like what makes me feel good. That way, when I walk into my bedroom in the evening, my room is nice and tidy. It feels good for me. So a signpost is when I notice for at least 3 days in a row or 3 days within a week, my bed doesn't get made. Because quite often we don't recognize when we're moving into burnout because we kind of go into that survival mode. You guys know what I'm talking about. We go into that survival mode where we're just doing what's directly in front of us because there's no bandwidth really to like take it all in. So when you make this list of signposts, and this is usually a good reflection exercise, and you have those things. So when I notice that my bed hasn't been made at least 2 or 3 days this week, I need to stop and check in with myself. Where is my energy going out? And where is energy coming back in? Because energy is not created, it's simply exchanged. So once you've begun to identify your signpost, look for the need that's going unmet. So one of the ways you can do this is that a sensory need, like requiring quiet time after work just to sit? Because for a lot of us, when we've been at work all day, and one of the things that does happen, because masking is a tool that can serve us, but if you were like me and for decades took masking to the professional level, which I call camouflaging, it is exhausting. It taxes all of your energy. So when I would get home, I would need like 2 or 3 hours just to sleep, not to do anything, don't talk to me. So this is called sensory rest. So is there a physical need that's going unmet that may be something that you normally would do, like go to the gym or go for a walk? So that's called kinetic rest, where you move your body in ways that energize you. This includes vestibular or physical stims like dancing or rolling your fidget ring. One of the most impactful self-accommodations, because at work, sometimes we don't have the comfort or maybe even the privilege of comfortably disclosing that we're autistic. It may not be a welcoming environment. And so a lot of times what we do have to do is look at what self-accommodations we can put in place. And you can implement these at work and at home. And one of the best things is to set a strict time boundary that you are being mindful of how much time and energy you spend on a task. Time blindness is a big factor for many of us who are also autistic and ADHD. And this is often a big contributor to exhaustion and burnout. So do a sensory rest appraisal. Look at the noise level in your home and in your office and see if there are ambient noise from lights, because we know this thing that vibrate, right? Equipment that may be draining you unknowingly. One of the ways I discovered this was when we had a power outage at my house, and all of a sudden I was thinking, oh my gosh, it's finally like calm and peaceful, and I don't feel like I want to jump out of my skin. And I recognized that when the power had gone off, it got quiet. Like the hum from the VCR and the lights in the fish tank and all the things were really physically impacting me. So maybe do a test and start unplugging some things around your house. I teach more on the 7 areas of rest that autistic adults need to stay off the chronic cycle burnout trap. And my course, Rest is More Than Sleep, on the Autistic community, if you'd like to dive deeper into any of the other areas of rest and begin your burnout restoration. The link to check it out, I can pop that in the chat, and you can find it on my webpage at Social Audi. But remember, take some time to look at what your sensory needs are, and take some time to look and see what your signpost might be to let you know you're moving into burnout so you can stay off that chronic cycle burnout track.
Everyone can play their part in making the world more understanding, accepting, and inclusive of people who are different. Gemma, what can non-autistic people do to improve society for their autistic children, friends, and colleagues?
If you want to become a fully inclusive organisation, friendship group, family, there are some small, easy ways to do so. However, it does also mean accepting the bigger or more unusual changes you may need to make too. If you can accept my honesty and dislike of small talk, but not my meltdowns, stims, or non-verbal moments, you're not being accepting of me as an autistic person. One positive experience I had was when I was in hospital due to an allergic reaction, and I was experiencing sensory overload. Everything was too loud and too bright, and the nurse was trying to get a blood sample from me. And through the meltdown, I managed to say I'm autistic when the nurse was asking why I kept pulling my arm away from her. And from me telling her that I was autistic, not just scared of needles, this changed everything. She turned off as many beeping noises as she could, stopped touching me, and started to explain exactly what was about to happen in detail, which vein she was putting the needle in, that it would hurt a bit, and got me to watch her doing it so that I was fully aware of my surroundings and the senses I was about to feel. Changing some of the ways you interact with us while still treating us like adults feels accommodating and accepting that we may be different in some ways, but we are still part of society. I think the best tip is to not make assumptions about how people should be. So don't treat others how you want to be treated, but treat others how they want to be treated. Some common easy wins for improving the lives of autistic people are noise cancelling headphones, comfortable dress codes, redefining professionalism. Meltdowns are not having a tantrum, they're natural physical reactions to an unsafe environment for us. By not preventing or being embarrassed of harmless stimming, by understanding that not all humans are verbal and some are nonverbal occasionally. In these instances, try to change your medium of communication. By speaking to autistic people for advice, we are ultimately the only ones who know what it's really like to be autistic, and we can and are communicating the ways in which neurotypical people can accommodate us. So also just by attending this and wanting to learn more, you're starting to open your mind to coexisting and working with autistic people, which is great.
Thank you, Gemma, for that uplifting message. I'd also like to thank all of our speakers today. I hope that you leave this discussion with a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be autistic and thinking differently about autism. I will now ask each of the panelists, what is one message you would like our audience to take away with you? I'm going to start with Claire.
It's so hard to, we tackled so many different topics. So the idea of there being a single message, maybe that is the takeaway, that we're all just really different. And so even though there are these things we have in common where we've had similar experiences not accessing accommodations or being misunderstood or trying to find a diagnosis later in life for a lot of us, that we really have to consider each person on the spectrum as an individual. So I would encourage y'all, you know, if it's you who's autistic, don't project your experience on the next autistic person or the person looking for a diagnosis. And if it's you supporting someone else, then just think about how they're not going to be exactly like the last person who you had the privilege of getting to know and supporting.
Charlie, what is one message you would like our audience to take away?
Autism is a really common neurotype. A lot of people go undiagnosed, and society must learn that we all have different strengths and preferences and challenges, and we have human needs.
Ryan, what is one message you would like our audience to take away?
I would say that you're allowed to be yourself and you should feel comfortable to do that, and don't be afraid in standing up for yourself and knowing what your rights are. And these are guaranteed under law, and that fundamentally you are a human being with the same rights as every other person.
Laura, what is one message you would like our audience to take away?
I think that sometimes when either advocating for yourself, your child, or autism and the neurodivergent community in general, it can feel very overwhelming, and it can feel like there's so much to do and so far that we need to go, but we're on that journey and we're at base camp already, and there's a lot of good people out there who can help you and who can give you advice and can give you support. So take that step back and take that breath and keep going, because it's worth it. It'll be worth it for all of us when we get to the top.
Ella, what is one message you would like our audience to take away?
I think that everything that we learn about autism can be really useful as like a toolkit that you can use as a consideration. But as other panelists have said, we are all individuals with individual needs. So to never make any assumptions about someone based on their autism, and also to learn about autism from a variety of sources, including people from different backgrounds, races, sexualities, gender expressions, so that you're really getting the full picture of the autistic experience.
Carol, what is one message you would like our audience to take away?
You are not alone. You are not broken or defective. You are wonderfully wired and neurodistinct. You have a place and a purpose in this world. You make a difference just as you are in this moment. You don't have to be anything other than who you are right now.
Gemma, what is one message you would like our audience to take away?
That being different should be celebrated, and that being normal or like other people isn't the goal. And yeah, as everyone else has said, really, just being able to be yourself and not being forced to mask or change should be what we all try to do.
I would like to thank all of our panelists. This has been an amazing discussion, and I hope the audience has learned a lot from it.
Thank you very much, Sienna, and thank you very much for our panel hosts. Panel, if you have not been reading the chat, now is a good time to open it because you are getting lots of thank yous and lots of nice comments. So please do take the time to read them. I mean, just to close the event, I think for me, it's so important that any autism initiative, whether it's during Autism Month or another time of the year, really listens to and includes the perspectives of the people it's claimed to be serving. And I think in Lexic, too often we see autism awareness events with parents and educators and HR professionals and medical professionals, and actually no autistic voices. So it's been a real pleasure to listen to your perspectives today. Thank you to Claire, Charlie, Ryan, Laura, Ella, Carol, and Gemma. Also, Claire, special thanks to you. I know you've been doing loads of Q&A to the audience as well. And of course, a huge thanks to our panel host, Sienna, who's not just hosting this panel, but also our next two panels. The next one isn't taking place in about 30 minutes time. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We will send you a follow-up email with the recording, with some of the panelists' social media tags and so on. All of our panelists are advocates or activists. They blog and write and share and do videos and research and work in this sector. So please do stay in contact with them after the event and follow their work. I think that's everything, Sienna, other than to say thank you very much for a great panel. And Team Lexic, I think we will end the panel there, please. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.